All right, let's go. Okay. Thank you, Waitbot. All right. Welcome back to True Crime Convos. I am your host, Lainey, and tonight we are discussing two cases that are very similar to each other. They involve familicide. So these are individuals who basically have annihilated their family. The two people we are going to be discussing tonight are Lowell Andrews and Andrew Brom. First, we're going to talk about Lowell Andrews, and then we'll go into Andrew Brom. But before we get started with that, we are also going to do a quick recap of the hearing going on for the Waukesha parade attack. That was the first episode that was released for True Crime Convo. Since we moved over to the Fireside app, we are also simulcasting on YouTube and Twitch. So never fear, you can always catch up on those episodes if you prefer. Wow. If you prefer a live stream format or a video format, you have several options to check. So tonight, I want to start with the Waukesha Christmas parade attack. I also should probably introduce myself. I'm Lainey Hobbs. I am host of the true crime podcast called True Crime Cases with Lainey, now the True Crime Convos Cases, or the True Crime Convos podcast, and the paranormal podcast called It's Haunted. What Now? I am also the co-founder of the True Crime and Paranormal Podcast Festival. Lots of things going on. Also, if you happen to be in the Atlanta area on December 3rd, we are going to be having a True Crime Live with so many people. You can check the show notes for more information and follow me on Linktree to find out what I'm doing, where I'm at next. Okay, so first, let's talk about Darrell Brooks. That was the first episode released on the True Crime Convos feed. As you recall, 11/21/2021, Darrell Brooks decided to take his 3,000-pound vehicle and ram it through a parade that was going on in Waukesha, which is in Wisconsin. He took 6 lives that day and injured countless other people. So today was the first day of sentencing where victim impact statements were read, or survivor and family advocate impact statements were read. And let me tell you, the family members, the survivors of these crimes, came guns blazing for Darrell Brooks. Now, you have to remember, they had been watching Darrell Brooks. If they weren't witnesses, it was totally fine. They had been watching Darrell Brooks on TV or on the Law and Crime podcast or YouTube feed, rolling his eyes, making a mockery of the court and its proceedings, treating the trial truly like a game. And they were frustrated and they were pissed off. A lot of them, every single one of them, I'll say, handled their impact statements with grace and dignity. And man, they came for him like nobody's business. They really, really pointed out his narcissism. Again, we don't diagnose people, so we don't know truly if he is a narcissist, but I think it's what generally people in the common world feel narcissists are. They're extremely selfish, manipulative, etc. We know that he's engaged in intimate partner violence, and so sure, maybe it's definitely possible that he is a narcissistic abuser. There's a whole lot that goes into that. So they called him out on it. They called him out on his crying and how it was fake, how he had no remorse whatsoever with what he was or what he did, and then how he continued to treat the proceedings. And it went on for the majority of the day. He did have a few outbursts because he wanted to point out, and this had already been addressed by the judge previously, but he wanted to point out that one of the survivors or family advocates had worked with Judge Darrow in some way and was trying to bring that up because he gave a really scathing impact statement. So he was trying to do something with that. What he was trying to do, I don't know what. If you are in any one of our chats, feel free to say hello. And thank you again for joining us. I always appreciate when everybody decides to join us live. If you don't remember, you can always catch us later, either on the podcast or by checking YouTube. So they did a great job there. And then it was time for the prosecution to kind of give their statement on the mitigating factors. And they went over his criminal history, much like we did in the first episode. They talked about his basic career as a criminal, and he was getting pissed off. He asked the judge to if he could go into the other courtroom, which he's been banished to previously, um, for his, disruptive behavior, etc. And the judge was like, "Nope, you don't get to ask to go there. That's somewhere you're taken to when you are disruptive to the proceedings." So he was pissed off about that. Him and Sue shared some barbs with each other. She said, "Mr. Brooks, I'm talking." And he goes, "I don't care what you're saying." And she's like, "Well, I don't care about anything you care about." And he's like, "I know you don't." And so, it's the end of the trial. It's really not going to have an impact, I think, on his sentencing. I foresee that he will have consecutive life sentences for each of the 76 counts. There is also restitution for $200,000. We saw this in the Parkland shooter case as well. The DA is requesting that the judge retain 50% of any wages that he makes in prison and any commissary money that he receives until he pays off the $200,000. And I anticipate that he will probably be upset. I hope the judge does exactly what the Parkland shooter judge did, and she withholds 100% of his commissary and wages until the restitution is paid off. He will have 7 lifetimes to pay it off, hopefully. But yeah, a lot of them were expressing disappointment that the death penalty didn't exist in the state of Wisconsin. And there was even some criticizing of the DA who took on bail reform. And listen, I'm for bail reform when it's applied appropriately and done correctly. I do think that, just saying like, no, everybody go free. I mean, obviously, we know that bail impacts those who are marginalized and those who come from poor environments, etc. So, not interested in debating that. It's just facts because it exists out there in research. Anywho, so that wrapped up day one of the sentencing. Darrell Brooks had told the judge that he was going to have 9 people speaking on his behalf. News outlets started to contact those people once they got the names. Obviously, he had to provide those names to the judge as she requested. Once they got the names and the names were out there in the media will do what the media will do. And so they started contacting some of these people. And many of them were like, I didn't even know he had listed me, and I have no intention of speaking on his behalf. So there's really only 3 people slated to speak tomorrow. It's going to be his mother, his grandmother, and another individual, maybe a friend. And then Darrell will also be able to give his closing statements on any mitigating factors, etc. The mother and grandmother, or the grandmother, I believe, put out a statement that really angered the family advocates and the survivors of this crime, because they believed that it leaned too heavily as an excuse that he was mentally ill and that he didn't get the help he needed. But I mentioned this last episode in that he didn't ask for the help. He also didn't take the medication he was supposed to take. So, it speaks to the lack of accountability on his end. And I'm very, very surprised. And maybe I shouldn't be because, when you come from a family of enablers, which his mom is an enabler, um, and maybe his grandmother is too, or maybe she doesn't really have any awareness of the totality. I can't imagine how you couldn't, but I think about my 86-year-old grandma, and it would be sometimes hard for her to kind of comprehend these things. So I want to give the benefit of the doubt, um, and say that, I'm sure we will hear much of the same things tomorrow. I'm sure they will do what their son and grandson could not do and refuses to do, which is apologize to the victims and the family members who witnessed, this tragedy or lost members of their family. Those impact statements were captivating. They were incredible. These kids, man, that showed up to the podium to give their statements, they had way more grace and understanding than I think he deserved. He did a really terrible thing and has absolutely zero remorse for it. He kept patting his chest over his heart every time they said things like, I hope you rot in hell, or I hope that um, just basically saying like they hope that he gets prison justice essentially. And he kept kind of mocking them. I mean, there was a girl talking about losing her mom and he rolled his eyes. He was just like, oh my God, was completely bothered by the whole proceedings and that he had to sit there and listen to people talk about how this tragedy impacted their lives. And he was absolutely just like pretending to pray and patting his chest and nodding along and then would flip and start rolling his eyes and stuff. So his mom and his grandma are going to take more accountability for Daryl's actions than he will, can guarantee it. He will also spend a lot of time tomorrow. I'm going to go ahead and call it. We'll update at the next True Crime Convos. But he will also spend a lot of time uh, defending himself against the statements of Sue Opper and probably going one by one through the victim's statements of things they got wrong, like very minute details. I have a feeling he is going to waste a lot of time tomorrow. I'm sure Judge Darrow will cut it off. And then I don't think it'll take her very long. I anticipate we will have a sentence by Friday. He is due in court for other charges in Milwaukee County, and then he's wanted in Nevada. He has a lot of charges pending. Not that it makes much of a difference. They may even end up being dropped because, and I've seen this happen before. That's the only reason I say it may end up being dropped because there's really no point in prosecuting him when he's going to be given a life sentence over and over again. I would be so surprised if she didn't give a life sentence for each one of those cases. The DA asked for each one of the counts to get a life sentence, and that it would not look good upon the court if she made a determination other than that for certain cases and not others, and saying like, oh, the guy before you was a little bit more worse off than you were, wasn't so bad, so he's only going to get like 40 years versus a life sentence. So I get what she's saying, but I also understand the difficulty that may come into play with Judge Darrow, because she does have to look at it, in total. I don't know. I would do a life sentence for each one because I think it sends a clear message. But career criminals don't really care about the sentencing. Career criminals don't really care about the consequences. They will still do it. It's the same way why, some people outside of the death penalty being applied to innocent people, they also know that it's not a deterrent, that we still have people murdering everybody, pretty much on the daily. And even in states, especially in Texas, that have the death penalty, it's not a deterrent. Not the way that they think it was when they first came up with it, I guess. I have no idea. Okay, so that's your quick update. Tomorrow, by the way, selfishly mentioning, tomorrow is my birthday. So if you happen to hear this on the feed or you're in one of our chats, feel free to drop me a happy birthday note. I'm going to be getting some tattoos tomorrow in celebration. I had a great weekend this past weekend where I had some friends and family get together to celebrate, since my birthday falls on a Wednesday. How lame. But yeah, I'm excited to usher in, and then of course get ready for Atlanta coming up on December 3rd. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the boys who killed. In particular, we're going to start with Lowell Andrews. So some background into Lowell. He was born to parents William and Opal Andrews, who were Baptist farmers. And, excuse me, they were anxious really to welcome their youngest child into the world. In 1938, they welcomed a little girl named Jenny Andrews, and she was outgoing and friendly. And she was 2 years old, and she was the apple of her father's eye. Her mother enjoyed creating adorable dresses for her to wear around town, and then they welcomed their second and last child, Lowell Lee Andrews, on September 21st, 1940, in Kansas City, Kansas. So they felt like at that point their family was complete. They loved on both of their kids equally, but growing up, Lowell was the exact opposite of his sister. He was extremely shy and introverted, but he really thrived in the church and was almost observed to be in like a trance like state when he was listening to hymns or the organ was being played. He really found his calling at church, if that makes sense. He unfortunately failed to shed his baby weight and was a robust young man. But as soon as he learned to read, he was basically unstoppable. He was a voracious reader. He was always at the public library and would spend his days locked in his room reading. And his mom, like I think any mother would be, was a little worried that her son was so introverted and shy that he wasn't socializing, and that he spent a lot of time lost in his books. And so she wanted to make sure that he was okay. She was just like, I want to make sure you're doing fine. And even though he mingled with the youth at church, he still didn't make any type of meaningful friendships. He expressed interest in playing the bassoon and he wanted to take lessons, and their parents were like, okay, great. Like, that may be a great opportunity to meet other kids or, you know, get a little bit more social by playing in public or playing at the church. And so they let him take the lessons. But unfortunately, that turned out to be another solitary hobby that Lowell, you know, took to his private nature, if you will. Now, like I said, voracious reader, but also an incredible musician. He was incredibly musically talented. He excelled, which is no surprise to me, in math and science, and he earned high marks, even though he, again, had no meaningful friendships. He didn't really interact with the students in his class, partly because of his shyness and introvertedness. He just didn't really have an interest in it. He got all he needed from, reading and the extracurricular things that he did that left him be by himself. Um, he gave no indication, not kind of what you would expect, I think, when you're thinking of somebody who's murdered their family, that you would have seen a sign and go, oh, this was the moment that his parents should have realized, like, there was something dark brooding in him. But there wasn't. There wasn't a big sign in there that would say, "Oh, red flag, Lowell's reading too much. Lowell's playing the bassoon. He's definitely gonna be killing people soon." Um, no, his teachers, other adults that were around him, they were like, "Oh my god, Lowell was so polite." Um, when all of his crimes happened and the media started coming out in a frenzy trying to get interviews with people that knew him, uh, there was a woman who said that he was like the nicest boy in Wolcott. He was just sweet, kind, and polite. This was something they would have never expected. He graduated from high school and he told his family that he was going to start going to the University of Kansas, which is in Lawrence, Kansas. And roughly at the time of where they lived, it was only about an hour away from home. So his parents, were happy they could still keep an eye on them, keep an eye on him, etc. Um, his sister Jenny, again, the more extroverted sibling, was like, I'm out of here. Sorry, I have to adjust myself. She's like, I'm out of here. I'm going to Oklahoma State University. And she left. She was like, I need my independence, need to get away from my family. I totally relate. I went 5 hours away for college. But there are other people very close to me that stayed home and stayed home their entire lives. I would always encourage somebody, if you have the opportunity and school is in your future and you want to go, then take that opportunity to go somewhere outside of your family zone if you want. I always encourage knowing a new city and a new town and being safe while doing it. So when he went to his freshman year, he chose the major of zoology and he joined the orchestra. So at this time, he was still a pretty large dude. He was about 6 feet tall and he was 260 pounds. And his mom was worried about him um, because she was worried that his weight would hold him back. He managed, though, to get through, and I don't know what she means by, like, holding him back other than socially. Obviously, it has nothing to do with academics or anything like that, but, those are cruel times. It's still cruel times for people who are overweight and, introverted, so he excelled in his freshman year, he got high marks, and he was actually really well liked by the people in his orchestra. So it gets close to Thanksgiving break. So, like many universities, people start leaving or they're going home. The campus is drying up, if you will. So, Jenny and Lowell are also going home to Wolcott, Kansas to celebrate Thanksgiving with their parents. Now, their time spent together was relatively quiet. Opal and Jenny spent much of the time preparing the meal in the kitchen. So, you had, if you can imagine it, we're getting very close to Thanksgiving. It's actually next week here in the US. We have ham, turkey, Thanksgiving pies. I mean, this was a time really when people went all out for Thanksgiving if they could afford it. Um, we are it's in high contrast to like how I operate now that I'm hosting Thanksgiving on my own. I cater everything. I was just telling my husband, there's no way I'm ever going to be like, wow, I want to make a turkey today. So if anybody else is catering or doing something awesome like that, or you're cooking a full fledged meal, kudos to you. Let me know what you're making so that I can celebrate with you and drool over the food. Now, while they're home, sister and mom are in the kitchen cooking and getting ready for Thanksgiving. Lowell is spending his time in his room reading his new copy of the brothers oh my god, Karamazov. Karamazov. Yeah, something like that. Sorry, I butcher it. And it was written by Dostoevsky. So the book had many themes that center around spirituality and its place in common society, voluntary suffering, greed, and patricide, which is the act of killing one's father. Now, on November 28th, 1958, at around 7 p.m., Lowell finished his book. He went into the family bathroom, showered, shaved, and put on his best Sunday suit. Then he walked and grabbed a 22 caliber rifle and a German Luger pistol from his armoire. And he looked at himself in the mirror, seeing himself holding his guns, and then he proceeds to walk into the family room. He ends up turning on a light. The family, his mom, dad, and sister are all in there watching a TV show. They're totally engrossed in it. So when the light turns on, you can imagine you're sitting in a dark room. The light of the TV is the only thing that's glowing. As soon as the light turns on, you're kind of startled by it, which is exactly what happened. So he aims his rifle first at his sister. She had no time to react, and he shot her between the eyes, killing her instantly. He then turned the gun on his father, William, who was now 50 years old, and he shot his father twice with a rifle and then quickly turned to his mother and shot her 3 times. Now, Opal was stunned from the shots and she managed to get up to walk towards her son. And so he ends up pulling the Luger from his hip holster and shoots her an additional 3 times. So, with those last 3 shots, she immediately falls to the floor and ends up dying from her wounds. But William, meanwhile, is attempting to escape. So he's crawling towards the kitchen. And it's truly out of a movie how this is all being described because as his father is crawling away, trying to get out of this house, probably call for help or ask for help, Lowell is stalking his dad slowly. It's imagine the Michael Myers walk. That's exactly what he's doing. So Lowell follows him and he shot him repeatedly with the Luger in the back. So in total, William was shot 17 times and died in a pool of his own blood in the kitchen. Lowell recalled showing no emotion and admitted that nothing had happened to prompt the murders. He just got it in his head to do it. And he did. He thought, hey, finished reading this book. Seems like a good opportunity to kill my parents. That's exactly what he did. He was cognizant enough to know that he wanted to get away with the murder. So there isn't anything here where he's in this fugue state, has no idea, sits down, eats some popcorn. He's like, nope, that was probably not a great idea. Now I got to find some way to get out of this. So he opened the windows in the main rooms, removed the screens, and knocked some furniture over and took out his mom and sister's purses and started throwing the contents on the floors because he was trying to make it look like a robbery gone bad. Now he starts to go, okay, I need an alibi. I need to say I wasn't here, right? That's how I survived. So he decides he's going to go see a movie. So on his way to the movie theater, he ends up dismantling the guns and he stops on a bridge that overlooked the Kansas River and threw the dismantled pieces of those guns in the water below. So he gets at the theater, and normally the introverted Lowell, right? You would expect him to grab a stick, go sit down. Well, no, he needs to make an impression. He needs to show people he was somewhere so people remember him, right? Again, cognizant enough to know that he needs to establish this alibi and he needs to make sure people see him. Well, he goes to the cashier and he ends up speaking rapidly to that ticket attendant and to the person manning the concession stand. He decides to watch the 1958 film called Mardi Gras that stars Pat Boone. And he ends up not going back to his home. He ends up going back to his rooming house where he was staying during college. So he ends up driving back to Lawrence and gets his like typewriter or something. And he spoke to his roommate and then his landlady again, making sure people see him, know that he was there, blah blah blah. So he goes to the gas station and he has another very lengthy conversation with the gas attendant. Um, this, like I said, was all calculated on his end. He was attempting to establish an airtight alibi. He wanted those people to remember, oh, yeah, I saw that guy pumping gas, or maybe it was self serve at the time. I have no idea. But, he wanted to make sure somebody saw him. And he had multiple people doing that. So Lowell ends up going back to his home. He feeds the dog. And then he's like, all right, time to call the police. So he calls the police around 1 a.m. to report that he had found his family shot to death and it looks like they've been robbed. So police come within minutes after his call and they find Lowell outside on the front lawn playing fetch with his dog. Now, word to the wise, I'm not trying to help you get away with a crime. I mean, it's 2022. It's a little bit more difficult now. But what I will say is if you just killed your parents and you're trying to play it off like you did not, best to seem sad about their deaths, especially because you love them so much and your sister, etc. Your whole family has just been removed and wiped off this earth. So playing fetch with the dog is not a good look. So the deputies that arrive on the scene, they end up asking him what happened, and he just points towards the door and he goes, just look in there. Flat, no affect, no crying, no tears, no, oh my gosh. I liken it kind of to Grant Amato, to Chandler Halderson, how they acted. Um, you can tell it was all very fake and very like forced. Lowell did not try to do any of that. He was very much, yeah, just go check in there and see for yourself, guy. And the deputies immediately noticed that he seems unaffected by these deaths. And they informed him that they're going to have to take him to the police station so that they can ask him a few questions. And, he, and also do some tests. Like, I think GSR is what I want to say. Maybe even I think that's it, a GSR test. So he admitted because of that, because he found out they were going to do tests, the GSR test, he admitted that he had actually shot his rifle earlier that afternoon because there was a hawk on the property that he wanted to kill. And, it was causing some trouble. So if you happen to find GSR residue on my hands, that is why. I'm sure they weren't like, oh, red flag. So they get to the interrogation, or they get to the police station, and they place him in an interrogation room. And he's just like, listen, I don't want to plan their funeral. I don't really have any interest. Just, I don't care what you do with him. That's literally what he told the deputy who was in the room with him. He said, you know what, actually, don't care what you do with him, but call my reverend, and he can probably help. So the reverend was VC Dameron. And when the reverend ends up arriving, he tells Lowell he's sorry for his loss and he prayed with him. And he got up to get a soda for Lowell and he sighed loudly. He looked over at Lowell because, again, he was also noticing his demeanor. And he looks at him and he goes, Lowell, did you have anything to do with what happened to your family? And I think because of how much Lowell loved the church and how much happiness he found there, something was triggered in him because he immediately confesses to his minister. And he says something along the lines of, I'm not sorry and I'm not glad that I did it. I just don't know why I did it. So he didn't really have any remorse. He was just really confused by the whole thing. The authorities were later informed by the minister or the reverend, whatever you want to call him, that the murders were prompted, I think, after some conversation and really trying to drill down to, like, why did you do this? That the murders were prompted because Lowell wanted to inherit his family's 210-acre farm and around $1,800 that was sitting in his father's savings account, which, again, I don't know what children and parents out there, hello? I don't know how these children know how much is sitting in somebody's bank account or anything like that. I'm like, I have life insurance on my husband and I have life insurance on myself, and I would never in my life go, oh, by the way, I have like $1 million. I don't. But if I had $1 million policy, I would not be sharing that with anybody. Keep that to yourself. You just say, hey, I have a policy with blah, blah, blah company. If something happens to me, you might want to call them. Or I have a policy with my employer. If something happens to them, you may want to call them. Or it happens to me, you may want to call them. So he wanted the 210 acres, the $1,800, and his father's savings account, which at the time, or now, would equal about $15,000, maybe a little bit more with inflation since things have changed. So he said that he actually started thinking about murdering his family. It wasn't as snap judgment as it seemed in the beginning. He said he thought about murdering his family since July of 1958 and considered multiple avenues of how he could commit the crime, but they all really seemed too risky. So Reverend Dameron tells him, listen, you should confess to the police. You should clear your conscience and tell them everything. So Lowell agrees and told them about the murders and disclosed where he discarded the murder weapons. And so the police were able to only get parts of the gun. Obviously, with the currents and things like that, they couldn't retrieve the entire weapon. Now, during his trial, his defense enters a plea of, say it with me now, I'm sure you know, not guilty by reason of insanity. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, which did make him eligible for the death penalty. His defense team opted to not contest his confessions. We often see, even if they confess, they get their Miranda rights, whatever, the defense attorney will always try and kind of throw it out. So this time they decided not to contest it. Now, on February 20th, 1959, a court appointed 3 psychiatrists from the Menninger Clinic in Topeka to evaluate Lowell. They found that he had schizophrenia, but did not experience delusions. Thus, legal insanity could not be established in this case. So he was found competent to stand trial, and the insanity plea was no longer valid. On January 18th, 1960, a jury of his peers found him guilty and he was sentenced to die. He did, of course, appeal his sentence on the grounds that he was legally insane. He believed that he was, and that the Reverend should not have been allowed to testify because Lowell was a member of his church and he was bound by clergy confidentiality, and that the judge failed to instruct the jury correctly. So on December 10th, 1960, the Supreme Court of Kansas affirms his conviction. Lowell then submitted a motion for a rehearing, which was denied in January of 1961, and his time on death row was closing in, and he tried one last Hail Mary to save his life. So he sent an application to the Kansas governor, John Anderson Jr., in the hopes that John would commute his sentence. But in March of 1961, the governor says, no thanks, not going to be a part of that, not going to commute your sentence. The United States Supreme Court also denied his appeals, and so he was sent to Lansing State Prison to sit on their death row, essentially. So while he's on death row, he ends up meeting two other famous murderers, Dick Hickok and Perry Smith. And those names may sound familiar to you because they were the subject of Truman Capote's infamous true crime book, In Cold Blood. So Dick Hickok shared his thoughts on Lowell with Truman Capote and said that Lowell had no respect for human life, including his own, and many who would witness his demeanor since the day of the slayings would share the same observations. So something clearly shifted in Lowell after the murder of his family. Something that people obviously didn't see before, or maybe were blind to it because they made concessions about his behavior and his aloofness based off of his introvertedness and, you know, his demeanor in general. So maybe you don't think the book nerd is going to be the one that's going to annihilate their family. But we have another serial killer who's sitting there saying, yeah, no, he's terrible. I think when you have another serial killer pointing at you and saying, this guy does not care about human life. This guy could give two craps about it. Uh, yeah, it's a problem. So on November 29th, 1962, Lowell, who's now age 22, he's preparing for his last day on Earth. He requested a final meal when final meals were a thing. Now they're not really anything anymore. Um, now they don't give prisoners the opportunity to say, oh, hey, I want this, or hey, I'd like that. They instead go, this is what you're having for your last meal. You don't get any like special accommodations. So his last meal, he asked for a meal of 2 fried chickens, mashed potatoes, green beans, and pie a la mode. He ate it alone in his cell, staying rather quiet that day. And then he was to be, and I know this sounds kind of crazy. You think this is like 1800s, but he was actually to be hanged by the neck until he died. When he approached the gallows, the warden asked him if he had any last words or requests, and he indicated that he did not. He was the last inmate, or one of the last inmates, to be executed in Kansas. He was pronounced dead on November 30th, 1962 at 12:01 a.m. So that's Lowell Andrews. Very curious to hear what y'all think about that because even though it was a quick little case, I mean, 22 years old, this guy is executed. It's incredible. And also, we have to remember that the mental health space at the time, psychiatry at the time, was not equipped, prepared. People in general were just like not equipped to deal with schizophrenia. And the way that I think maybe now they are, our mental health system, especially in the US, is not great. Hi, Brer Rabbit Illuminati. Thank you for joining us. Um, you know, I hope, I mean, it still sucks in the US, but I think compared to the 60s, it's gotten a lot better. So maybe there would have been something, maybe there would have been key indicators that he could have gotten help, but who knows? It's a tragic case, 3 lives lost on a whim, essentially. That's really sad. Okay, so we end the Lowell family murders. Or sorry, not the Lowell family, Lowell's murder of his family. So 3 decades later now, we're focusing on another family who would lose their lives over something seemingly innocuous. So David Brahm was born on October 3rd, 1971 to Bernard and Paulette Brahm in Rochester, Minnesota. He was the second oldest of 4 children, and he grew up in a well-to-do and well-adjusted household, according to most reports that were out there in our research. The Brahm family was devoutly Catholic and encouraged their children to build on their faith by enrolling them in Catholic schools. In 1988, David attended the Lourdes Roman Catholic High School, and much like Lowell Andrews, he was an exceptional student who had an aptitude for poetry and for writing. But he stopped being what you would say is a good kid, if you will. He stopped being a well-behaved child in his younger years, or once he entered his teen years, rather. He became really rebellious. In the late 1980s, heavy metal music was what some parents would consider to be the epitome of rebellion. Bernard Brahm was one of those parents. He did not find this type of music to be acceptable for his son to listen to, and he saw David as a little punk. He was like, listen, if you continue to listen to this music, you're going to lose your way, and you're going to commit crimes, you're going to be a criminal, all the things that music does not make people do. As we know, especially not metal music. I mean, like, unless they're like, "Go kill somebody right now," and he listens to it on loop and then decides to do it, I think you have a case. But if you're listening to, like, AC/DC, I don't know about all that. Make sure you're hydrated, water break. So, the 2 often, Bernard and David often bickered over his behavior, his musical choices. Again, this is late 1980s, so it's kind of the teen angst movie that you would expect to see. David hated that he was being oppressed in his mind by his father and that he was being judged. He believed he needed to be expressive and he needed an outlet to express how he was feeling. So he became so frustrated with his father's nagging that he often told his friends that he wanted to kill him. And you hear that a lot kind of in passing, especially when you're a teenager. I've never said I wanted to kill like my mom or anything like that, but maybe now it's different, right? With all of the mass shootings, unfortunately, and the way that crime's happening um, in the US, especially. Maybe now it'd make more of an impact, but I think about when I was in high school and my friends were talking about them being frustrated with their parents and be like, oh God, I wish I could, like I could kill him or something like that, or I'll kill you. Um, Most often, I'll say, maybe that's too much of a generalization, but I want to say, like, most often, when you say that, you're not really intentionally, or like, I'll murder you. You're not really saying you would murder them. Like, reasonable people aren't going to do that. But David was saying that. The classmate brushed it off and was like, this is just something teenagers say. Like, I've said it, whatever. Um, like I said, is there a person? Find me a person in the world. I'm sure there'll be that one person who ends up finding this. Find me that one person in the world who's never like jokingly said that they would kill someone. But I know that again, I know I've said things like that. That was never my intention. Like I would never go through with it. Um, but that wasn't the case for David. He went to school the next day and again made the same comment, but this time to another friend. And they had no way of knowing that he would commit one of the most heinous and brutal crimes in Rochester history. So, on the evening of February 18th, 1988, David and Bernard began to argue yet again over a cassette tape. The argument was heated, and both parties separated due to the escalating tension. Now, I grew up in a home, unfortunately. Thank you also to those joining us on Twitch and on YouTube. You are awesome. And joining us here on Fireside. Thank you so much. I forgot to give a shout out earlier. Also, we drop our ASL in the chat. So if you are watching us on YouTube, Twitch, or in the stream, we drop our ASLs at the beginning. So feel free to do that if you are interested. We also recognize pronouns. So For instance, I'm Lainey, a now 35-year-old cis female, she, her pronouns, out of Dallas, Texas. And then everybody else goes on to share theirs with us in the chat. Okay, so we're back to the argument. They end up separating. And like I said, I grew up in a household where I had a brother who um, was very vocal and violent if he drank. So much so he would destroy our house and all this stuff. So, when there was this escalating tension happening, even between my two older brothers, they would often have to be separated because it was like, yeah, these kids are going to kick each other's asses. We got to get them out of out of each other's faces. Um, so it's 11:30 and David goes to his room and he's extremely enraged. He is upset over the argument and he paces around contemplating what his next steps are. Now, the family eventually went to bed, and David made his way to the garage where he retrieved an axe, and he wringed the handle in his hands and made his way into his parents' room. Parents are already asleep, and so David stands over his dad, who was asleep in bed, and without much thought, he ends up raising the axe above his head and slams it down with brute force on his father's head. Now, you would think immediately somebody's like, you would be dead, out instantly. But Bernard was actually stunned by the first blow. And so he attempts to get up because I forgot what it's called, like what the phenomenon's called, like when you experience a massive brain trauma or head trauma, like your body's like, whoa, something happened, try to survive. And so things you would think like, oh, you would just stay in bed or you wouldn't be able to move. That's not exactly what happens. Um, his dad tries to get up. And now, because he's doing that, and because he's likely made a noise because of the injury, his mom wakes up and she sees the scene before her and she tries to escape. But David ends up swinging at her and injuring her. So she made it to the top of the steps before she ends up collapsing due to the injuries. And then he went to his 9-year-old brother Ricky's room and was shocked to hear a scream come from his brother before he even hit him. Now, David ends up hacking at his brother and screaming with each blow. And 9-year-old Ricky put himself in a fetal position in an attempt to protect himself. Diane Brom, who was David's 14-year-old sister, was leaning over her mother in an attempt to help her when she was attacked by her brother. She was unable to escape the frenzied blows to her body, and soon the only surviving members of the Brom family would be David and his older brother Joe, who was not at home at the time of the attack. He was left, as you could imagine, this is not a clean kill like you would expect with a gun, maybe. Um, this is with an axe. So blood splatter, spray, he's covered in blood. And he ends up taking a shower and he shaves his head into a mohawk and then dyes it a different color. So this is his ultimate act to David. This is his ultimate act of rebellion. Like, you think I'm so bad, you think I'm the worst kid ever. Here, I just showed you. This is what I am. And now I have my freedom and I can do whatever I want. So what I'm going to do is give myself a mohawk and dye my hair. He knew that he needed to go to school later that morning so that he didn't draw suspicion to the absolutely gruesome scene that was just outside of his bedroom door. And he ends up getting ready for school and recall that his mother and his sister are both dead at the foot of or at the top of the stairs. So he actually has to walk over their bodies on his way out. Like, this kid, my guy, like, ridiculous to fathom. Like, I cannot fathom, because I would never do this, but I could not fathom the absolute callousness you have to experience, or compartmentalization that may happen in your brain when you don't see the carnage that you created. And just walking over the bodies, to me, is just such a callous thing to do. Yes, the murders are too, but I would think there would be some indication of like soberness in that and going, holy shit, what did I just do? Oh my God. I don't know. What do you guys think? What is your feeling on that? And did that make any sense? Let me know. So, steps over their bodies, goes to school. He reminds me of, who was it? What's the case? I can't remember. Krista Pike. Krista Pike. He reminds me of Krista Pike. Krista Pike murdered a classmate of hers, or workforce mate. I forgot what they're called, the work corps, um, job corps participant, over perceived jealousy that she was talking to her boyfriend. And Krista had walked around with like a piece of her skull and was showing it off and was so giddy and was pointing out like the blood and all these things. This was basically David. David could not contain his excitement when he got to school. And he shares with several of his friends that he had actually killed his entire family. He told one friend in detail what he did, and it later was used against him, obviously, in witness testimony. She said that David confessed to hitting his father with an axe and kept hitting him to stop him from getting up. He said it was actually pretty disgusting and that someone had to be really sick to do something like that. Now, the grapevine, because this is high school, so if you're confessing to murder, it's going to get around. So the grapevine at high school is a buzz with rumors circulating around um, the fact that David killed his parents and killed his family. So David ends up leaving school at the end of the day, and he makes his way to a concrete plant to hide out in a culvert. He obviously knows and probably is a little scared that he's run his mouth too much, and now police are probably going to start looking for him. So school officials, because obviously this gets around to them, they contact the sheriff's office and say, listen, we've heard reports of a young man claiming to have murdered his parents and murdered his, siblings. So you may want to go and check this out. So two officers arrived at 5:30 p.m. and they announce their presence when they get to the door. They don't have a response, so they knock again and then enter. Now they search the first floor and find nothing. They make their way up the stairs and they are then greeted by the bloody and mutilated body of Diane and Opal Brom. Immediately, they call in dispatch to inform them that they had two fatalities, and then several minutes later, they end up updating dispatch again to say they found two additional fatalities, and an urgent BOLO was issued for David after contact with 19-year-old Joe was made, because they were like, okay, well, we need to know which, is David okay, or is he dead, or is Joe okay, or is he dead? So once they found out Joe is fine, they now turn to finding and apprehending David. Um, Residents in the quiet neighborhood obviously were on high alert. They were worried, they were scared, and they look for the blue van that was often driven by David. But he was actually still in that culvert until the next morning. He ends up making his way to a local payphone the next morning and is spotted by somebody driving by. He was quickly found, apprehended, didn't give any fight whatsoever. And he appeared to be nervous and scared, but he remained quiet the entire time on the way to the police station. So he's interrogated, doesn't offer any information about why he committed the four murders. And he was 16-year-old. He was 16 at the time of this crime. And it creates a little bit of a predicament in the court system. You either decide you're going to charge this 16-year-old as a juvenile defendant, which means they could likely be out by the time that they're 21, or you're going to charge them as an adult and they will either face the death penalty or they will face life in prison, depending on the state. So initially, he's charged as a juvenile offender. The following day, he ends up getting arraigned. And at that point, his nerves are gone. He's not scared anymore. There was this big shift in him. The police officers who were around him were like, yeah, when we first arrested him, shaking, scared, like doe and deer in the headlights type of look. And now at his arraignment, he was calm. and he seemed to be at peace. But he ends up being formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 8 counts of second-degree murder. He enters a plea of not guilty and was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation because this doesn't just happen, right? Or from the belief like a 16-year-old just doesn't do this. Maybe there's some undiagnosed psychiatric disorder, maybe there was severe abuse going on, etc. Well, while the psychiatric evaluation is pending and he's going through that process, the state prosecutor ends up filing a motion to charge him as an adult, which the judge, Ancy Morse, decides to approve. Now, David comes back and pleads not guilty due to mental illness. Now, they have to, of course, determine if he's competent to stand trial and to determine if he does have a mental illness, does it excuse his rationality of knowing the difference between right and wrong. And this is where the McNaughton rule comes into place, and this is where it was reviewed against his psychiatric evaluation. If you've never heard of the McNaughton rules, these were adopted in the US in 1851. So, in part, there's a presumption that the defendant is sane and therefore responsible for any and all criminal acts they perpetrate. However, at the time of the crime, if the defendant suffered from a disease of the mind and did not understand, while they were suffering from the disease, the difference between right and wrong, or didn't understand what was right and what was wrong, they can be declared not guilty due to insanity. These McNaughton rules are very strict, and it's very, very difficult. You will hear this through any true crime podcast that covers any type of trial or where the defendant attempts to use not guilty by reason of insanity or not guilty by mental defect. It's very difficult to get an insanity plea or to be seen as not incompetent to stand trial. So David didn't meet the standards of the McNaughton rules, and he was found guilty of he was found guilty of all counts and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. Judge Ancy Morse, who oversaw the proceedings, disagreed with the sentencing guidelines and felt that David should have been sentenced to a mental institution to receive treatment for his mental illness. And at the time, there wasn't a lot of information about like what type of illness David may have been suffering from, but in jail, David does attempt to take his life multiple times. And there was a doctor named Dr. Carl Malmquist, who was a psychiatrist assigned to evaluate David, and said that David actually suffered from progressive depression that would worsen over time without treatment or without medication. As you know, I've already talked about this, but the mental health resources in the US are atrocious. They're even worse once you enter the DOJ. People say like, "Oh yeah, you got new teeth," etc. But when you go to prison and stuff, they're always complaining that they get any type of treatment or whatever. But within the DOJ, psychiatric assistance and treatment is practically non-existent. Inmates will often use their pills as to trade for commissary or for favors or etc. So they often go untreated. It's sad. So David Braun currently is housed at the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Stillwater, which is in Bayport, Minnesota. He's going to be eligible for parole in 2041, and he will be 70 years old. This guy has been behind bars since he was 16 years old. Joe Braun, his brother, went on to be a professor of philosophy, but passed away due to cancer in 2016. 30 years after the murder, a local radio station released a mini documentary detailing their experience covering the Braun family murders. And I don't have the clip anymore, but it basically went into the events of that day and kind of what it was like to cover the crimes as they were happening. For these 2 individuals, Lowell Andrews and David Braun, while they murdered their family in cold blood, there are very stark differences to their demeanor and to the punishment. Lowell Andrews had no remorse for the slayings of his family and was hanged for his crimes. David did demonstrate anger issues and rebellious behavior that led him to, and likely an undiagnosed mental illness that led him to murder his 4 family members. To this day, David's motive is still unclear. He never spoke publicly or offered any true explanation for the murders. He did show some emotion when he was initially detained for the murders of his family, which is different than Lowell, who said, like, I don't feel bad for what I did, don't really care, but whatever. David's depression, while was also taken into consideration in his sentencing, or the judge wanted to take it into consideration. I think they considered it a mitigating factor in his sentencing. Um, Lowell, however, again, remember stark differences versus 1980s versus the 60s. Lowell suffered from schizophrenia, and there was no consideration for that in his sentencing. His schizophrenia was essentially dismissed as a mitigating factor. But I'm curious to hear what the chats think. Listeners, when you listen on the podcast later, what do you think? Do you think that Lowell should have been sentenced to die based on his diagnosis of schizophrenia? Now we know that any individuals typically who suffer from a mental illness or mental defect, and it's actually been proven in court and through psychiatric records or medical records, they're often not put to death because it, I believe, violates the constitutional rights they have. You have to check me on that because it's been a while since I've looked at that. And then what do you think about led to David murdering his family in such a really vicious way? Be sure to share your thoughts with me if you'd like to in any one of the chats, or you can send us an email. You can do whatever you'd like to, comment on YouTube if you'd like. That is our show for this evening. I have always appreciated you joining us here on True Crime Convos. Remember, you can catch the stream fully on YouTube, or you can download the podcast and subscribe to it on any podcast platform. Just look for True Crime Convos. You can follow me on Instagram, Lainey Hobbs VO, on Twitter, Lainey_VO. That stands for voiceover. Anyways, I hope you guys have a great rest of the evening. Thank you for taking the time to join me for True Crime Convos. Be sure to wish me a happy birthday tomorrow.